Welkom bij de Nieuwe Wereld. Verdiepende gesprekken in een tijd van verandering. Mijn naam is Thomas Bollen en vandaag is bij mij te gast Brad Scott. Hij is monetair antropoloog, een voormalig broker en auteur van het boek Cloud Money. So, welcome Scott.
Hey, good to be here.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, no problem.
Here's the Dutch version of your book.
The Dutch version's out.
Cloud Money.
Yeah.
I read it in English the day it came out. And
that's good to hear.
I found it a really nice, compelling, interesting book.
Mm-hmm.
So I immediately contacted you. Can we talk about your book? And finally you're here in the Netherlands.
It's been a while, but it's good to be back here.
So let's start with your personal motivation to write this book, because you worked on it for about 3 years.
Yeah. So I guess I had a book that came out in 2013 called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, which was a guide to, I guess, understanding and reforming the financial sector for civil society, people who didn't know much about finance. Mm-hmm. And that came out of me working in the financial sector, in the realm of derivative contracts and stuff during the financial crisis. So I wrote this book for people to sort of help them to understand the financial sector, but also about how to think about building alternative forms of finance. And actually, since then, I got very heavily involved in many different types of alternative finance projects through, alternative banking, alternative currencies and stuff. But I noticed that after the financial crisis, a lot of these tech firms, fintech companies, were also imagining themselves as being a type of alternative finance, right? This that they were democratizing the financial sector, that they were somehow going to be the ones that would help to reform the financial sector. And I guess I got drawn a lot into those circles, but I started to become very aware of this intersection between finance and tech, and how actually ever increasingly they were merging together in various ways. And so this book kind of comes out of me experiencing that process, watching that process happen over time, seeing how the narrative has shifted in the fintech industry. And to this point where nowadays we're basically seeing big tech and big finance fusing together. And this book is looking at that process. But I'm also looking at how it plays out in the monetary system. And in particular, how the cash system, which is this offline physical money, is being is under process of attack, and largely because actually there's this process whereby it sort of stands in the way of this fusion between big finance and big tech.
This merger. That's also, I think, the first line in your book. Eh? It's about a merger of big finance, big tech, and an acquisition of power.
Exactly.
Very nice.
I like that line.
Yeah, I liked it too. I thought, that's a really good start. But this is counterintuitive, as in what you're sketching, the way that the fintech or the Bitcoin community views itself is as a counter-revolutionary. They're putting up an alternative to our banking system, so they are the revolutionaries, and they're fighting against big finance, and they're gonna democratize our monetary financial system.
I'd make a distinction between the fintech community and the crypto community. Okay. Back in 2012, 2013, 2014, there was a very strong distinction between those communities.
Okay.
Fintech was basically a kind of Silicon Valley style startups that were taking sort of Silicon Valley style technology and porting it into finance, all right? Whereas the crypto world was kind of really perceived itself as very, very different to actually that sort of mainstream world of the sort of Silicon Valley in a sense. Okay. But of course, we've seen these worlds get more and more entangled over time.
So the fintech was from the start something like, we're going to just improve our payment systems, work together with the big banks, but do it like in a fast startup way.
Fintech, very, very simply, is basically the process whereby you automate finance. So you take any process that's currently not automated in the financial sector and you automate it, and then you sort of market that as being a kind of revolution in a sense. All right, and that's largely what the fintech world has been up until now. But the crypto world, in a sense, defined itself partially against that. You know, albeit nowadays, maybe we're jumping ahead in this conversation. What's nowadays called DeFi, decentralized finance, is a little bit like a kind of variation on fintech. It's just like it's like fintech in a slightly more decentralized structure.
As time went on, the money pouring into the Bitcoin community has also attracted maybe a different style of...
Totally, yeah. I know that the cultures have shifted radically over time. Yeah.
Okay.
But the book is I mean, I'm covering crypto in the book, but largely the book is looking at essentially initially the physical cash system versus the digital, the mainstream digital system, which is a system you're using when you're, you know, tapping your card or your, you know, Apple Pay app. Yeah. You know, and that's the sort of the mainstream digital money system is run by the banking sector. And then, so the original kind of battle in a way is between the sort of physical money issued by the state and this digital money issued by the banking sector. That's kind of like one battle. And then the sort of the crypto thing is slightly on the side and it's sort of positioned itself relative to that.
You start early on in the book with the scene of you being in the mountains in South Africa where you grew up, and you're using a compass to navigate. And I think that I really like that analogy of how this compass helps you to find your way, but it also makes you addicted to it in a way that you can't find your way if you lose it.
Exactly, yeah. So one of the big themes in the book, and this is a theme that goes beyond my book, it's a theme in sort of technology critique more generally, is this contradiction we have with technology, which is we're always told that it empowers us. And in some ways it does, but it always simultaneously disempowers us in the sense that we become dependent. So when it's removed, suddenly we're disabled, all right? So if you zoom back in time to imagine like a very sort of self-reliant kind of community, they're often very low technology communities, right? So like you're...
like the Amish in the US.
Exactly. Or... So in a sense, you can see the trade-off in the situation. They maintain a high degree of autonomy, and they sort of, you know, you can also think, for example, like an uncontacted group in the Amazon. They'll have very low levels of technology, but very high levels of autonomy in the sense that they know exactly how they survive, they can make everything that they need to survive and so on. Whereas if you go to some massive city, you'll have people with extremely high levels of technology, but also extremely high levels of dependence. All right, and that's the kind of one of the core contradictions we have in our society. And we tend to have a sort of default ideology that says more technology is always better, but at some level, everybody simultaneously realizes that they're incredibly dependent. Actually, most people nowadays will probably, if you ask them, you say, are you addicted to your phone? People probably will say yes. Many people basically understand that they're addicted and they don't quite know how to deal with that. All right. They've kind of almost also forgotten what it was like to not be addicted to that. So they almost can't even imagine a situation where they're not. Yeah. And I think this is the situation here with technology more generally. We have a sort of dominant story, which is that it's always empowering, and yet we simultaneously have this awareness that actually somehow we become ever more dependent. And one of the core features of modern digital capitalism is that unlike in the 1950s, in the 1950s I might have been dependent upon types of technology, but I'd have some option to not be connected to the companies once I'd use their product. Let's say I buy a car in the 1950s, right? From Ford Motor Company. It's a very large company, it has lots of power, but once I have the car, it's my car, and I can somehow escape. But what's happening nowadays is that a lot of these companies that we're dependent upon, we can't escape them. We're constantly dependent upon them, all right? So we're always connected into them. And this is a very sort of new style of capitalism that we're in. Yeah. And the digital money system is much like this. So going back to this, sorry, it's a very long answer.
No, that's good, that's good.
Going back to this compass metaphor, in the book I'm trying to convey this idea that, in my country, in South Africa, there was a time when there were the indigenous Khoisan people would be navigating using stars and their intuition and experience. They didn't need compasses, right? They actually held this knowledge in their community and in their body, essentially, right? Whereas me and my brother, my dad taught us to do sort of map reading with a compass, and we had this idea that we were really like tough guys and stuff for using our compass, but actually, comparatively speaking, we were dependent upon this instrument. But now you fast forward to today, everyone's on Google Maps, and it's like they basically are relying upon this distant entity to tell them how to move around, right? And so you have this ever-increasing amounts of technological power, but ever-increasing amounts of dependency in that process. And that's the core contradiction that many of us are facing right now.
And now if your battery is empty, you're lost.
Yeah, literally.
And so your personal skill is at a very basic level. You're completely dependent on these external entities, big corporates in many cases.
And have you seen, for example, the classic case of this, the easiest way to see this is when people are flying a plane. And as that plane lands, what's the first thing that happens?
Everybody grabs their
Everyone
phones.
takes their phone and reconnects in, right? Because basically our lives actually cannot operate unless we're connected into these huge entities.
And it's not just a personal choice, it's also a way of being in our societies, because our societies depend on it. Like if you don't use a phone, you really exclude yourselves from a lot of aspects of social life.
Exactly. And this is one of the core changes that we've seen in our economies more generally, is that many of these big firms have now become infrastructure. If you think about the Ford Motor Company, a big corporation back in time, it wasn't ever infrastructure. Right, they're selling products that you can buy and then you can use on infrastructure, but it actually isn't the infrastructure itself. Whereas now what's happening is a lot of these big companies have literally become the means via which you interact with the market. I mean, you can't interact unless you go via these companies, and that's a structural change in an economy. So when these private players become infrastructure, that's when they literally become the foundation of our very being, right? And that's a situation which is very, very dangerous for a variety of reasons. And one of the points I'm making in the book here is that the cash system, which is the physical money system, is one of the few systems we have that can act as a kind of counterpower to the digital system, which is run by these corporates. And so I'm arguing for this balance of power within the existing monetary system. So you have to maintain a balance of power such that the infrastructure of payments doesn't become completely privatized.
So because we are already kind of forced to use these private forms of money. Like if I want to pay my taxes, I cannot even pay in cash. I have to use my bank account, transfer the money to an account by our tax authority.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people don't really realize in society, and maybe I'm not fully answering your question straight away here.
It wasn't really a question, was it?
Yeah.
But I mean, like, it's already so in our system right now that we don't even think about it, and we're already forced to use the means of payments which are run by big banks and big corporations.
For sure. And those systems are connected into each other. And so the core metaphor that I'm using in the book to sort of illustrate some of the dynamics of the different types of money we have is this metaphor of a casino. I don't know if you recall this.
I do.
And so one of the problems I've come across over the years when I'm doing stuff around monetary systems is that many people believe that there's one type of money. Right? And they say, okay, well, it can be physical or it can be digital, but basically it's the same money. All right?
Yeah.
So many people, when they think about the units in their bank account, they think that it's just like, it's a little bit like cash, but it's just digital, right?
Yeah.
And one of the core things you have to always convey is that it's actually a totally different type of money issued by a different player, right? So the best metaphor to convey this is that I've come across is to get people to think about casinos, to say, okay, so if I go to a casino and I have, let's say, 100 euros and I hand it over in cash to the casino cashier, and then they give me chips, casino chips.
Yeah.
Those casino chips are a privately issued form of money that you can use within the casino, but they only have power because they're essentially a promise for the cash that you have the cashier. They're kind of a secondary type of money that's tethered back into the first type of money. And in many ways, what the banking system does a related thing. If I was to hand cash to a bank, they would take ownership of that and they issue out these digital chips to you, almost like digital casino chips. And those digital units you see in your bank account then are these privately issued chips by whatever bank you have. But in some ways, they're psychologically linked back to this the cash that you have. But the great power that banks have is they can issue out far more of those chips than they actually have in government money, as it were. And that's what it's all about. This, a lot of groups who are interested in monetary reform will talk about this power that banks have to create money, and that's what they're doing there. But what's going on right now, when you're moving away from the cash system, essentially what you're doing is you're moving into this realm where you're becoming totally dependent on these bank-issued chips, digital chips, as it were. And many people don't really realize this, that they sort of think, oh, well, it's kind of the same as cash. And you really have to sort of stress, no, it's not. It's actually a totally different type of money. It's issued by different players. Has different dynamics. And that's basically what the cashless society is. It's a society where you've been forced into these types of
and we
systems.
grew into this system because it wasn't designed deliberately in this way. But formerly, we used cash a lot more. Half of our money was I looked at the Netherlands, for example. After the Second World War, half of our money was the government issued money that we used, and there was half of it was privately issued. Yeah. And then, because of the digitalization, we moved towards using digital money because our economy is taking place online, and we're using these automated payments, and that's all using bank money. And now it's more than 90%, even 93, 95% of our transactions that we do, we use bank money instead of the government issued money. And the only form we have is the physical notes and coins.
Yeah, the only form of government money is the physical type. But bear in mind, it's important to make a distinction for anybody who's looking at this between the issuer and their sort of position in the overall picture versus how they issue, in what form they issue the money. So, for example, so I would say, like, these state players. The Eurozone's slightly more complicated, but let's just say the state. Okay, let's imagine the ECB and all these different types of players as a kind of like a state. This is sort of a first level type of money, base money, right? Yeah. The bank money, which is those casino chips, is a second tier type of money, right? So those are the sort of levels, but then you can actually have different ways that those levels are implemented. So in the state layer, it's issued in both physical and digital form. Yeah. So the physical form is what we call cash. The digital form is what you call reserves. But in the bank layer, it's only in digital. But there was a time back, in the sort of 1700s, 1800s and stuff, when banks were issuing this sort of second tier types of money in physical form. So there's a lot of the stuff around how, in America, there used to be private banks who would issue banknotes, and those were a second tier type of money in physical form. Yeah. But now it's all digital, right? So you kind of got to separate out the digital versus physical, and it's a slightly different question to the
but the digitization of money automatically moved the population to using this private money because there is no digital
form of state money. Exactly. Well, the banks are allowed to use a digital form of state money, and that's the reserve system. And the big debate.
But it's a completely separate circuit. We as citizens and companies do not have access to these digital reserves.
So the debate right now, of course, about CBDC is whether you should allow ordinary citizens to access a digital form of state money. So right now, the battle in the monetary system is between physical state cash versus digital bank chips, as it were. And the question now becomes, should there be this another option added, which is digital state money? Digital state money, which would upset the whole balance of power, right? So that's.
But let's because I definitely want to discuss these this digital form of state money, central bank digital currency, but we could think of, different forms as well. But let's step back a little bit, because what is the role of big tech in this whole system? Because big finance exists for centuries, but big tech is relatively new, and they see a business opportunity here, or how do you define this? This part of the realm, the money realm.
Sure. Well, look, part of what I'm arguing in the book here is the typical story we're told about cashless society is that it's a bottom-up process. So, and this is something that will be told about many technologies, right? It's somehow driven by ordinary people making sort of consumer choices, right? So you'll see sort of newspaper headlines that say things like, hey, consumers shift to digital payments, right? The implication is that somehow the agency in our economy lies with ordinary people. And what's happening is that everybody is sort of just naturally and organically making shifts, right? A large part of the big part of the picture that's missing there is how the fact that we live under corporate capitalism, which has massive players who have far more power than we do, right? And often they operate as oligopolies, right? They actually do business with each other before they do business with us, all right? And a lot of those oligopoly players are all pulling in a particular direction, and often they're attacking certain parts of the system, right? So the cash system has been under attack from the top down for a long time, which is making it ever more likely that there'll be these bottom-up moves towards the digital system, right? So one of the really hard things to convey to people is that many people will experience themselves, say, starting to like tap their card and be like, oh, well, maybe I should just use digital instead of cash. But what they won't have seen is how the infrastructure and the sort of ideological landscape has over time been totally sort of engineered in a sense, not completely engineered, but at least heavily influenced from the top down to make it ever more likely that you're going to do that, right? And that's what's really hard to show a person, right? And then the players who are actually involved in this process is, well, one, the banking sector. And the banking sector for a long time has attacked the cash system, right? Because the cash system, the banking sector runs the underlying accounts infrastructure of the digital payment system. The payments industry has spent a long time attacking the cash system, like Visa and MasterCard outright engage in propaganda against cash. But when you look at fintech and big tech, it gets more complicated, right? Because they don't, like Apple and these players don't have an overt commercial agenda in attacking cash because they don't use cash. So for them, it's more kind of a structural, when you zoom out, and you look at the overall global economy, the only way that players like Amazon can expand is if people shift to digital systems. The cash economy represents to Amazon a type of part of the economy it hasn't conquered. Right? Because the cash economy is peer-to-peer. It's very much it's very localized.
They're not part of this cash economy. Amazon is not part at all of the cash economy.
Cash is antithetical to the business models of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley revolves around basically getting millions of people to send messages to central data centers. Right? So imagine Uber. Send a message to the Uber data center, get it to instruct a driver to come to you, then send a message to Visa and MasterCard to tell your banks to transfer money to Uber. Everything is basically these central players who interact with each other, and then we interact with them from our phones. That's their model, right? Cash is like people at a street level handing each other units of state money. Like for these tech companies, it's a nightmare. There's no way they can interact with that system, right? They can't automate it. Right? And that's why they hate it. Whereas a lot of people actually do like the cash system because we're human beings and we're not giant corporations, right? So what we're having in terms of the ideological battle is the fact that all the stories about progress come from the centers of power, all right? So slowly we fed the story that what progress means is ever more automation, ever more speed, digitization, et cetera, and it's clashing against what a lot of ordinary people believe, which is actually like, hey, I'm a human being and I like contact.
It's funny because if you talk about digital payments, they're faster, they're more efficient. But there's actually a sandwich place in Utrecht where I live, and Broodje Mario, and they only accept cash. And I asked them, why don't you use bank cards? Because I was implying, well, maybe it's got some tax benefits or something. He said, no, it's because in rush hour, we just have too many customers, and our automated card payments take too long. So they tried it and they moved back to cash.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a big debate whether actually cash is less efficient. It actually often more efficient. But the ideology, the story in society is that it's less efficient.
Yeah.
Okay. So
and the second part is that it's used to evade taxes.
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff around all the ideological attacks against cash, like, oh, it's for crime, tax evasion, and many people have internalized the story.
Yeah, because we see drug barons carrying these big suitcases full of cash, of dollar bills.
Yeah, but the drug barons actively use the normal digital payment system that the banks run. So it's not like the digital.
So you say it's more a myth.
It's not like the digital systems don't have crime and huge amounts of tax evasion and avoidance and stuff going on. I mean, they're actively used for that. The banking sector, which runs the digital payment system that supposedly solves tax evasion, the banking sector actively facilitates vast-scale corporate tax evasion, tax avoidance. All right, the massive big tech firms like Apple have huge tax avoidance programs, all right? So the idea that somehow these huge automated digital systems are somehow, like going to be free of all these types of social ills is a total myth. And what's interesting is to see how so many people have internalized these stories. So I'm often interested in how the process of cultural hegemony. So cultural hegemony is this idea where you have like certain groups in society, their interests get projected out into the rest of society and actually get internalized into the culture. All right. So for example, right now, if you go to many young people and many of them have begun to associate the idea of progressive progress with Apple Pay. All right.
Yeah.
This is an incredible situation of cultural hegemony. Basically, a single corporation or set of corporations have managed to create the idea that their commercial interests represent modernism and progress. And many people have culturally accepted that idea. So for them, they don't even need to have advertising. They don't even need to compete, really. They basically have inserted themselves into the culture. And a lot of what's happened in our society is that this general idea of big tech representing progress has sunk in, and many people will then actually start to attack the cash system themselves. They'll say, oh, but it's only for people who are stuck in the past, even though right now the cash system actually represents one of the few things that's standing between you and total corporate domination, right? So this is the problem we're fighting against, is that actually the cultural power of these big corporates is so huge that many people will actually have bought into the idea of their own domination. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
and this is also, incidentally, is linked to the rise of the far right right now. So one of the big messages that's coming out of the far right is people who quite rightfully feel like they're living in a kind of dehumanized system, all right?
Yeah.
And are searching for ways to express their humanity, and so that can get channeled into all this kind of like religious nationalism and stuff like that, right? Or sort of forms of, if you have kind of ideologues in this situation, they can very much channel people's angst to say, you feel like the system of corporate capitalism you're in dehumanizes you. Well, it does dehumanize you. So here's this alternative where we all like reclaim our identity and so on, right? And that's what a lot of the far right is actually working on right now.
So you say they're taking this feeling that people have that they're living in this surveillance capitalism.
Exactly, and this is what's been like the huge coup of the far right over the last 10 years has been to take the anti-corporate message for what used to be a realm of the left.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. If you think about a lot of the messaging coming out of the sort of far right stuff, it's about the global elites, it's about the World Economic Forum and so on, and they put this very right-wing spin on it. All right? But a lot of the intuition that they're working with among people is a lot of people do feel that they're increasingly herded into these types of enclosure systems, right?
Yeah.
And that feeling isn't illegitimate. But how you channel that feeling and what you do about it is where all the sort of politics comes in, right? And I think this is one of the very dangerous things that's happening right now. There's many people right now who do feel like they've been pushed into systems that they have no control over, which means that when the ideologue comes along and says, hey, the reason is that this, there's this like shadowy global elite who's doing this to you, then they will buy into these stories.
So what is the motive of this global elite? But let's define it as just big corporations who search for more control, more data, because if you pay with cash, there's no data, there's no trail that you leave behind. Whether if you use a card, you leave your data behind, and there's less costs for the bank to fill up the ATM machine. That's used as an argument, but I think the real argument is that they want to track.
Banks are profit-seeking corporations, so they want to cut costs and boost revenues. Yeah. Like, you don't even need a conspiracy, right? This is just what corporations do. Yeah. They sit, they look at their figures, they say, hey, the ATMs and the branches are costing us money. We make money off fees and data from the digital systems. Hey, why don't we shut down the ATMs and the branches and push people into digital platforms? I mean, it's just like what corporations do. Yeah. Right? It's like a business decision for them, and they'll just like project it. If they have enough power, they can project it onto people without having any consequences because they have enough power to do that. So for them, and a lot of those times, those corporate CEOs will perceive themselves to be in battle with the other corporate CEOs. So they might even say, well, we have no choice. We have to do this. Yeah. Right? Because
otherwise we're lagging behind.
Yeah, we'll be lagging behind those guys. ABN, we got to shift to, and so on. So they imagine themselves in a battle, but this will basically entail projecting automation onto the population. And if the population doesn't like it, well, too bad, because you're going to have to do it anyway. All right? Because all of the banks are doing it. So this whole idea that you have some kind of choice in this process is kind of illusory, right? And this is why you don't even need to imagine a global conspiracy. All you need to realize is that there's these oligopoly corporate players who have particular strong interests that over time they will just move more and more towards that situation, because bear in mind the general population often isn't as well organized as those corporates are. Yeah. So a lot of what's happening in society is you have groups with very strong interests, strong focused interests, like a bank that's trying to automate, versus a population which, most people, for example, in society would prefer to have, say, cash remain an option. Nobody likes having options taken away from them. Yeah. All right. Most people, you say, hey, do you want it to remain an option? They'll say, yes, I want it to remain an option. Who doesn't want it to remain an option? It's the industry, right? So when places are going cashless, what they're basically saying is we're taking away this option because we're making a corporate decision, right? It's not what society wants, it's what a corporate sector wants. And because they will project that into a population who sort of will say like, oh, well, I guess I have a bank card. I guess I'll go along with this because it's too much effort for me to resist. This is how they just basically take over, right? Yeah. And to stop that, you need political action, which is...
Our central banks are saying, well, cash needs to stay, we must have cash in our society. Also for, the story is often the old people can't use digital money, so that's why we need the option. So then...
That's not the reason, but yeah.
But what is your plea, like, why do we need cash?
We need cash to maintain the balance of power in the monetary system. Okay, so that's at a broad level, right? You don't want your monetary system taken over by single players. And the main metaphor I use for this in the book and more generally is to talk about cash as being the public bicycle system of payments, all right? The digital system is like the private Uber of payments. The cash system is like the public bicycle system of payments. Now, again, you might be a person who likes to use Uber. It doesn't mean you want Uber running your transport system, all right? A lot of Dutch people will realize this. People like having these different types of transport. So the same with your monetary system. You want different players, firstly to maintain the balance of power, but also if you don't maintain the balance of power, all the negative sides of those digital systems come out, all right? So if you actually were in a cashless society, the amount of surveillance would be crazy. Once you have control over the monetary system, your ability to project power onto people through the monetary system becomes huge, all right? So you can stop people doing things and so on. And bear in mind, in a capitalist society, you don't have the option to not exchange. The only way we survive is through exchange. So the monetary system, which is the mechanism by which people exchange, is a huge, it's a hugely crucial infrastructure. And if you have these players that have now complete oversight over that infrastructure, the ability to project power via that infrastructure is crazy. All right. So many people in authoritarian countries realize this. Actually, if you were in a cashless society, the ability to watch what you're doing and control you is huge, right?
Yeah, because once there's no cash anymore, there's no alternative. You're forced to use these systems.
Yeah,
and the transaction costs will go up. You just have to use it, so you'll accept that they use your data because.
Exactly.
Well,
you
if you refuse,
choice,
you're
right?
Excluded from society.
Exactly. And you will feel that right now. So I live in Berlin, and in Berlin you still have very high cash usage. So there's a choice in Berlin still. I can actually choose what type of payment I make. Yeah. When I fly to London, London's increasingly just completely sunk or slumped into the arms of the banking sector and Visa and MasterCard. Basically, when you arrive in London, there's a feeling I get in my body, which is like, if I don't go via the institutions, I can't interact with you.
Yeah.
Right. Our personal interactions are dependent upon institutional acceptance. Right. You literally cannot transact unless Visa and MasterCard allow you to. And that changes the whole feeling of society when you suddenly realize these power these players have as infrastructure. And that's why you need to maintain this breathing room through having multiple systems, right? But then more importantly, or as importantly though, just like the resilience of these systems goes down when they're totally digital, right? So one of the big reasons why national security officials and central bankers are concerned about the decline of cash is that if you become totally dependent on the digital systems, there's suddenly now huge new vectors for cyber attacks, cyber terrorism, the ability to bring an entire economy to a standstill by bringing down its payment system. But also just like if the electricity goes down, suddenly your economy is like stops. And then finally, exclusion. It's like if you can't get access to those players, or if you don't want to be a person who has to rely upon them, you basically get excluded. Right? And so having that balance of power is very, very crucial to prevent all of those negative sides of the digital systems coming out.
So let's go back to the central bank digital currency that we discussed. So this is basically a digital form of state money.
Yeah.
And it's being discussed in central banks all over the world as they say it's a complement to cash, but people fear that it will be a replacement of cash.
Yeah.
What is your view on CBDC, and do we need it, or is it a threat? Or
you should tell me your view on CBDC. I'd like to hear your view on it.
I'll say what I think. I think it's a necessary complement to cash that we have right now, because we don't have a digital form of state money, which we have to accept in a way that our economy is running for a large part online. So I think it would be useful if we have an option there as well, so we can choose for a public form of money. So that is my first observation.
So my first observation is that the very first time I heard about the very first communities I came across this debate around central bank digital currencies was probably like back 2015, 2016, so on. I came across it in monetary reform groups who were basically interested in how do you kneecap the banking sector? How do you reduce its power? All right. Well, you can try to put legislation in and say you don't have the ability to create money and so on. Or else you compete with them via the state. All right. And so the central bank digital currency thing was originally, in my experience, came from monetary reform groups saying if we could get the central bank to issue its own digital currency, people would suddenly have an alternative to the banking sector, it's going to
exactly. That's like groups like Positive Money in the UK and here in the Netherlands.
So this immediately illustrates part of the politics of this question, is that in most capitalist countries, the central bank doesn't really want to compete with its own banking sector, right? So a lot of the central banks were, they're not
hesitant.
They're not monetary reform groups, right?
No,
they're not.
Actually, there was a lot of initiative here in the Netherlands. We had a debate in our parliament, and well, it seemed as if there was enough support to talk about CBDC and experiment with it, but it wasn't done until 2019 when Facebook introduced Libra and said, well, we might introduce a stable coin issued by with a group of people. And then suddenly central banks started thinking about it.
I think I wouldn't say it's because of Libra, really. I mean, I think maybe for some small countries it's because of Libra, but bear in mind a lot of what happens in the sort of, I'm an anthropologist, so I'm often interested in the sort of the cultural processes going on.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these like strange processes of inertia that happen in big institutions where like one central banker sees another central banker saying something at some conference, and they feel like they got to say it, and then the media says it, and suddenly they find themselves caught in these narratives that they actually don't really control. A lot of central bankers, I think, are very skeptical about CBDC and don't want to do it because they realize that if they start issuing their own digital currency, it's going to compete with the bank's systems, right?
Yeah.
But they find themselves simultaneously in this public debate where they're having to sort of pretend, in a sense, that they're interested in this. And then, of course, things like Libra get brought up, and they feel like they got to respond to it. I think what's really going on here is that what's happened is that because of the cash system, the physical units has been undermined by the banking sector, the central banks are feeling pressure to maintain access to the public money system. So let's go back to the casino metaphor I was talking about. In a casino, the reason why I trust a casino chip is that I believe I can take it back to the cashier and get my cash back. So in the meantime, I'm happy to use it around the casino in the belief that I can actually redeem it, right? Yeah. It's very similar with digital money. Those units you see in bank accounts, the reason we sort of take them for granted is because we believe they're redeemable, all right? If you suddenly have the cash infrastructure collapse, because the banking sector has often been attacking the cash system, it actually can undermine confidence in the digital system, right? Because those digital units are tethered back. So a lot of the central bankers realize, they say, okay, we need to maintain public access to a form of state money. And maybe this digital alternative CBDC becomes the way that we do that. But the dilemma for them is that if they actually issue the CBDC, they start to directly compete with the digital offering that the banks have. So historically, the power balance worked. They would say like, okay, the state runs the physical system and you guys run the digital system. But if they start having a digital system, now it's a whole like.
But if we go further back, then we had the paper system, and there was a balance of power between the central bank in the state and the private banks.
Yeah.
So we actually have to just look a little bit further back, and then it is a normal power balance.
Yeah. So, but I think the political question right now is how would that balance change? All right, and this is why I think this debate is very fraught, because a lot of the people, a lot of bankers don't want the central bank to compete with them digitally, right? So behind the scenes, they're lobbying.
For the banks, it's competition. So exactly, behind the scenes, I think they are quite.
And if you're in a capitalist state where you have a sort of ideology that what the role of the state is to support corporations, so that's what you find in the US, for example, it's quite hard for central bankers to be like, well, we're going to start competing against you, right? They're the way they.
But historically they did, so they just have to reinvent themselves.
Exactly,
and rediscover their role.
I'm not saying it's not possible, but this is where all the political angst right now comes from in this debate. And then, of course, if a central bank actually does start issuing the digital currency, so that one question is how it will affect the banking sector. The second question becomes how will they implement it, in what form? And so a lot of the public angst around surveillance is much, much stronger when it comes to the state than when it concerns corporations.
Private corporations.
Right now, the corporations already spy on everyone. They're already doing surveillance. All the digital payment systems involve surveillance. All right, but people are very, very sensitive when suddenly it's the state doing it. Right. Yeah. So if this is why in the central bank digital currency debate, there's a lot of the kind of right wing of getting really caught up in this idea that there's a surveillance monetary system is approaching. It's the CBDC. The surveillance monetary system already exists. It's called bank system. But of course, for a central bank, politically, it's going to be very, very hard to come out and say, like, hey, we want to do this like the CBDC. It's going to be very hard to do it without provoking a public backlash around the surveillance.
Yeah.
Right. So I think it's an interesting question if they do it, how they'd implement it, and if they'd put in very strong privacy protections.
Yeah. So don't you think that Facebook entering this money realm also accelerated this debate, because we somehow do trust the banks with our information, but we are wary of Facebook?
Yeah, sure. I think what frustrated me about the debate around Libra when it first came out was I felt like, you know, when I'm looking at monetary systems, I'm looking at the sort of these layers of power. You know? Again, using the casino metaphor, you have the sort of the core system, you have the second degree chips, and then there's all these third degree players like PayPal, who will take your bank chips, as a word, issue
another layer on top of those.
Right? So there's all these third layer players, and basically Libra was a third layer player. But the main difference is that it just plugged into a bunch of different national systems. Yeah. Right?
And it would be such a big third layer player that actually the third layer could become so important.
Exactly. So the concern amongst nation states about Libra wasn't that, oh, Libra's about to take over from my central bank. It was that Libra could put a layer between us and the population. Right? So imagine you're like in India and you're just seeing Libra units rather than your Indian bank's units, which is then the Indian central bank in the background, right? So in the Libra system, you'll still have the central banks in the banking sector, but there's just this sort of like an interface now between you and those players. Now, psychologically, that could disrupt the balance of power in the monetary system. And I think what was a concern for a lot of these players was saying, you know, what's going to happen in the background if a player like Facebook has now inserted itself between us, and then people are using like WhatsApp messages to like transfer money internationally. This means Facebook is going to be trading in the foreign exchange markets in the background, doing stuff. It's going to be like affecting our monetary policy. Right? And I think that was a lot of the sort of angst around Libra was about that. But it's not like Libra was about to become the world's central bank. It was plugged into the world's central banks.
It was a third layer.
A third layer, yeah,
so
exactly.
let's put Bitcoin and the crypto community into this conversation as well, because what we see there is also, well, we discussed the early promise, like the rebels who would take on with the banks and compete with them. Now we see a lot of we saw stable coins coming up, which is again a third layer system, which is built on top of our bank account units, and then we suddenly have a third layer of Tether or USDC, and that was the currency which then is being used in the trade of other cryptocurrencies. So you use Tether to buy Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin, buy Ethereum, things like that. So that's the system that has grown out of it. So how do you see this system as an alternative to bank money, and can it play a role within our monetary system, or what role will it play?
So I'd make a strong distinction between the world of stable coins, which are basically like decentralized PayPal, right? Or not even that decentralized sometimes, actually quite centralized.
They're centralized, and they're run by people from the British Virgin Islands.
Theoretically decentralized. But they're basically like, I would put stable coins, at least the backed ones, into the realm of things like PayPal, Venmo. Stuff like Bitcoin, I put in a totally different category. The problem that we have in the debate right now is because stablecoins use some of the blockchain technology, they kind of like get lumped in with Bitcoin. People say stablecoins and Bitcoin and then this system. And it's like, no, stablecoins are more like in this system. And then there's stuff like Bitcoin, right? So a lot of the debate is really like, is something like Bitcoin able to compete with these monetary systems that are all plugged into each other? So our actual monetary system has all these different, the US dollar is multiple different currencies issued by different people that have the same name. All right,
Yeah,
you got the Federal Reserve, you got the banking sector, you got PayPal, you got stable coins, and they're all like locked into each other in a whole sort of structure. That's one thing, right? Then something like crypto or like Bitcoin, I guess this was the question has often been like, can that actually compete against this other type of system? And I would say no. All right. For a long time, I was involved in the Bitcoin community, and it certainly can't compete with this system, but it certainly, what I think it's very good at doing is almost like parasiting off it. All right. And I can explain why I think this. But I think the best way to imagine stuff like Bitcoin is a kind of like a parasitic system that relies upon the actual monetary system to be a kind of host, you know. And, you know, if I was an ecologist looking at an ecosystem, and I'd see different types of creatures in the ecosystem, a parasite is actually quite successful. So calling something a parasite isn't an insult. I could actually be saying, hey, you're a very successful creature in this ecosystem. And I think Bitcoin actually is very successful at what it does. It's very, very good at parasiting off monetary imagery, parasiting off this idea that it's like some kind of alternative, but it's completely dependent on being priced in the actual monetary system. And so what it does is it uses like the US dollar system as a host, but then it sort of creates these new strategies within it. And I think that's possibly quite politically important. But yeah, in my analysis of Bitcoin, you know, I think if you're trying to understand things like Bitcoin, a lot of the intuition that came, that went into building it was people back in the 1990s looking into the future saying, if we get stuck in a cashless society, we're going to be in trouble. Right, so a lot of the intuitions that come out of that led to cryptocurrency were very sound. People saying this is a problem if we get totally caught in these corporate systems or state systems. And so this sort of led to Bitcoin, but the problem...
And the idea was that it's a decentralized system that people can use. It's democratized in a way.
Yeah, so look, the main I tend to describe this in a slightly different way to most people. But historically, in people trying to build alternatives to big systems, the original meaning of decentralization originally meant, if you think back in the 1800s and stuff like this, was to say, take one big system and break it into lots of small systems that we can control locally. So the original idea of decentralization was we don't want to be subject to control from very far away. We want to keep control here. Okay, and that's often only works at a small scale. You know, a lot of sort of, if you think about anarchist communes and people trying to make their own sort of communities, you can often do it with like 150 people, but it's very, very hard to do it if you've got 15 million people. Right, so historically, like large-scale markets depend on these very large-scale institutions that they're going to act between us. So what the whole sort of excitement around the crypto world was this idea that you could do large-scale coordination without central entities. So this is why it caused so much excitement amongst people, is this idea that, hey, maybe we could have these huge-scale systems where we can still have all these goods that rely upon huge-scale production, whilst not having the central entities that normally hold those huge scale systems together.
And what did it turn out into?
So that's the underlying technology. And I think that's interesting. It's important to realize why people find it exciting, right? But the problem is in Bitcoin is, of course, that what they ended up doing was, while the underlying technology was very interesting, they actually just implemented a very, very crude system on top of that, a very, very crude token system. All right, so Bitcoin to me is a very crude style of token implemented in a very sophisticated way. All right, but in the end, the token is quite, like, it's very, very hard for people to understand. Actually, what Bitcoin tokens are, if you analyze it and go into into it, is basically numbers that you write out after you've exerted energy. I mean, that's what the Bitcoin system is. You exert a bunch of energy, then write numbers out, and then you can move the numbers between people. Right, and then there's a sort of a secondary process on the side where you culturally try to create the idea that what the numbers actually are sort of units of digital gold. Right. And that
idea sticks in the minds of people.
Yeah, if you're an alien coming from outer space, an alien anthropologist, and you came and you looked at the sort of the system, you'd say, okay, well, here's a system that writes out numbers after a person's done a certain amount of work. All right. oh, here's a cultural effort on the side to associate this idea of this number with like a unit of some kind of commodity. Like this is what the Bitcoin system is like very fascinating for. It's just like creating this idea that these numbers are commodities, all right? Whereas our existing system, the numbers in our bank accounts are actually liabilities of the banking sector and the central bank, so they're quite different. So a large part of the problem in Bitcoin is that people don't really know what these units are, and so they actually what they become is objects to be traded within the normal monetary system. All right, so they have this,
and that's the problem. Why it's not, you can't see it as a currency, as a replacement, because we still price Bitcoin.
Yeah, but this is why you can see it as a parasite, because once you take a unit of Bitcoin and it becomes priced in the normal monetary system. So let's say it costs 10,000. You have this ability to send it to somebody else to swap it for things. Right? And that's a process called counter trade, where basically you use the monetary price of one object to decide. So if you have, for example, something that costs 20,000 through the monetary system, and I have this unit that costs 10,000, I can say, I'll give you 2 of these units for that thing. What we've really done is we've used the monetary system, the dollar system or the euro system, to decide on an exchange ratio between 2 objects, and we've swapped them. So actually, that becomes quite interesting, using Bitcoin and stuff for counter trade, right? And this is what, if you, for example, are a political dissident and you're saying, hey, I'm excluded from the normal banking sector, but hey, I can use this swappable digital object that has a volatile price to maybe get stuff. You can actually use it for that, but that's very different to saying it's about to replace the euro. Right? It's actually dependent upon these systems.
Okay. I could talk a little bit longer about this topic. I find it really interesting, but we have to move on. We're approaching the end of our conversation. And I'd like to look a little bit toward the future. So we explored all these different ideas. We're stuck in this moment where cash is still disappearing. It slowly is disappearing, and you explained why we shouldn't we should not let it disappear. But what are the options? So we have Bitcoin, we have this development of central bank digital currency, we still have the physical cash. So we want to keep the physical cash, but what do we want in the digital world? What do we need?
You know what, like in a way, I've been avoiding that question because I feel like to some extent it distracts from this quite important political task of protecting the cash system. So I think politically, a lot of people find it acceptable to say, hey, what type of digital system are we going to have? But very few people right now are saying, maintain the physical system, right? And this is partly because ideologically in our society, because of how corporate capitalism works, the dominant overarching story beyond nation states is this idea that what human progress means is ever more scale, speed, automation, digitization. So most nation states are playing into this idea, right? So they say, okay, well, we got to have our digital version of this. So the debate is like, what type of digital do you want? Whereas what I'm doing is introducing this thing saying, we got to
let's
think about
keep cash.
So in a way, I'm concerned about what the composition of the digital systems are. But I also am very aware that the debate around the digital often distracts from this one saying we should actually be keeping this physical.
We keep it physical. But it's also a way of because cash is not working. We can't get people to use cash. At least we're failing in a way. But we're failing to do this.
Well, this is
so you can say we can use the digital alternative to at least introduce state money, get it away from the corporation.
For sure. I would agree with you on that. I'd say, okay, if we are going to go into a totally digital system, I want there to be alternative versions of it. I would agree with you. In a society where there's only a digital, I would want CBDC to be present. All right? Especially a CBDC that's got strong privacy protections built into it. Okay.
Which is also possible if we design it.
But what I want to say is that I think it's a very bad idea to buy into this idea of the inevitability of digital, right? Because that I think is actually wrong. I think this is why I often use this metaphor of cash being the public bicycle system of payments. All right, because what the industry tries to do is to sort of say that, hey, cash is the old horse cart of payments. And a lot of politicians have internalized that message too. So if you think about when politicians are protecting the cash system, what do they often say? They often say, well, there's still some people who use it. Still. You know? Imagine if you said, oh, there's still some people who use bicycles.
Yeah, that's then you think it's very old-fashioned. So
that language basically means, oh, there's still it's like people back in the early 1900s saying, oh, my grandparents still use their horse cart. And give them some time, they'll eventually get a car, right? We've got to break that narrative. What you're going to do is to say that narrative is false, right? We have to have systems that have parallel options and balances of power. So this is why I use this bicycle metaphor, because actually the bicycle is a type of technology that preceded the auto industry, and yet it's more popular than it's ever been, partially due to a cultural movement that demanded that we should have different types of transport options available, all right? And I think this is actually possible to do in our society. We can actually have a strong counter push to say we demand alternatives. And the reason why we don't have it right now is that the central banks, because they're these sort of public institutions, don't do any form of messaging, right? The only players who message and do advertising are the private players. So they constantly have told us for the last 30 years, switch to our systems. Whereas the public system gets no form of press, right? But I think if you actually had a lot of strong messaging saying, actually, this is important to keep, and to have cultural movements building, saying this is important to keep, we could shift that narrative. So I don't think it's inevitable that people... and I've already seen people even young people who are starting to realize this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot. Your book is in the shops right now. Cloud Money.
Cloud Money.
Thanks for the conversation, Brad.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Vond je dit een leuk gesprek en wil je meer van dit soort uitzendingen zien of beluisteren? Abonneer je dan op dit kanaal.